Hello everyone. Welcome to the Oxford Martin School. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School. And we're here in the Old Indian Institute through the generosity of the Martin family. Welcome to the first of a series of lectures this term, which is called Evolving Economic Thought. And it's a great privilege this evening to introduce my predecessor but one as director of the Oxford Martin School, and it's Ian Goldin. Ian is one of the most original thinkers around a lot of topics, including on migration and on globalisation. Now, Ian's talk this afternoon is called Losing It, and I can assure you that does not apply to the speaker himself, but it applies to the topic. Ian's title is Losing It, the Economics and Politics of Migration. Ian, come to the stage.
Thanks very much, Charles. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to be in the rather strange role of not introducing, but speaking. Having introduced so many people. But this is a topic that I'm passionate about, and I'm delighted that I've been asked to kick off this series on new economic thinking, because I think it's a topic that demands that, and also reflects, as I hope I'll be able to show, some of the complexities of thinking about migration and the new need to think about it in an interdisciplinary and fresh way, which is, of course, exactly what the Oxford Martin School was built to do, and so it's appropriate for that. One of the founding groups that we created in the Oxford Martin School was the Institute for New Economic Thinking, clearly a sign that the school is deeply committed to new ways of economic thinking. And the program which I now run, which you see is on technological and economic change, is also trying to do that. I also happen to be the chair of a charity called Core Econ, which is a new economics curriculum, and it's free online. So if you're interested in new economic thinking as part of your attending the seminar series, I encourage you to look at the Core website, which is now in over 190 countries and has been downloaded over 4 million times. So add to the numbers on Core. It's great to see Robin Cohen here. Robin was the director of the International Migration Institute in the Oxford Martin School, and it was one of the groups, I think, that really did push forward our thinking on migration, which is so vitally needed. It's a topic which, although is absolutely vital to all of our lives, indeed none of us would be here this evening were it not for migration, that is muddled, to say the least, in the way that people think about it. And of course, it's become central to political debates with this disconnect between the economic dimensions, the historical dimensions, and the ideological and political dimensions being at the heart of my title, Losing It, because I think we are losing the battle of ideas in this area. What I'm going to talk about is largely the result of a collaboration in the series of work that's been funded by Citibank, Citi GPS, and if you're interested in the sources and drilling deeper into this work, I encourage you to look at the free PDF download of this GPS, and I'll show you the link at the end. But it also draws on previous work I've done, a book called Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future. And that title really reflects what I believe this topic is about. Migration has defined our world. Everything in our world is the result of migration. It's indeed what defines humanity. What separates us from all other species is our ability and capacity to migrate and to adapt, which is why we've peopled the earth, of course. But all great civilizations, all great breakthroughs have been the result of intermingling. And of course, at the heart of this is the dynamism and diversity that's at the center of migration. Now, although people tend to feel that we're in a period of true exceptionalism, and certainly if you read some of the newspapers, you'd think there've never been more migrants. This very much depends on the lens that you look at it through. As a share of the world's population, we've clearly been in times of history at much higher levels of migration than we have currently. There have been periods of time not only for immigration, people coming into a country, but emigration, people leaving a country, where you had very significantly, perhaps double, the levels of migration that you have today. One thinks of the age of mass migration, the second half of the 18th century, and you see on the left-hand axis the share of the world population and the numbers on the right hand, and as a share of the population, we've been in much higher places before. Indeed, in terms of emigration, there were periods of history when a third of Ireland, for example, migrated, a third of Scandinavia, a third of Italy migrated. These were very big mass movements of people. And in countries like the US, Argentina, and elsewhere, Australia, there were periods when 40% of the population was immigrant, which is very much higher than it is today. Of course, in terms of numbers, not as a share, but in terms of numbers, because the world's population has grown so significantly, that's the gray shaded area, if you can make that out, the numbers are much bigger. And so, as with everything, how one conceives of this depends in the way that you frame it, and framing it as shares or framing it in terms of numbers makes a very, very significant difference. But it's proportions that matter. It's because proportions define many of the things like the resource use, the attributes, the contributions, and so I think we need to be very careful in the way we think about this. When we look at the migration stock, that's the total size of the migration numbers, we see the darker blue is migration, the lighter blue is refugees, the addition, that much of the increase in recent years has been attributable to refugees, both as a stock and as a share. And this is really the story of forced migration, forced not in the way it was forced in the age of slavery, where perhaps 20 million people were forced to migrate, or in the age of forced migration, indentured laborers, following that largely, but forced in the sense that people are in fear of their lives. Persecution, conflict, climatic disasters, etc., are what account for these flows of refugees. People who are desperate in every sense of the word. Now, of course, looking back at history and thinking about slavery and forced migration immediately highlights another point, is that not all migration is good. That indeed was a barbarous, horrific blight on humanity. But increasingly, when we think of migration, we think of it as a voluntary action of people moving, with the exception of refugees. And this level of about 3% has been relatively stable for at least 50 years, hovering above 3% of people moving voluntary. Which is to say, if you want to think about it conversely, that about 97% of the people in the world don't move. About 3%, a very small minority, have, and that's been very stable over a very long period of time. Much lower share of people moving now than, say, in the late 19th century. Now, another thing that's very important to get right conceptually is what one's talking about and who one's talking about. And I like to distinguish very strongly between refugees and other migrants. Some might think of it, but for me, I keep this distinction between refugees and migrants. Refugees are people who have no choice. Refugees are people who, if they stay where they are likely to be killed or severely persecuted. For me, this is about what we believe humanity has the right to. It's about human rights. It's about ethical positions. Do we believe we should let people die? Do we believe we should let them die where they are? And if they move, do we believe we should let them die crossing the Mediterranean or crossing the Straits of Dover or elsewhere? What is our view ethically on the right of humans to survive? And what will we do if we're in our shoes? It's also for me a very personal and historical perspective, because I certainly wouldn't be here. Both sides of my family, my father and mothers, were refugees, or their parents were refugees. So this is, for me, an ethical question, and it's governed by a very strict set of global conventions and rules. Clearly, there's some shortcomings with these rules, but the main shortcoming is not with the rules themselves, which set out a clear legal framework. The main shortcoming is with our interpretation of these rules and our application of them. And this is very variable. So most refugees, about 95% of refugees, go to neighboring countries of the 25 million or so refugees in the world. Turkey alone has over 3.5 million refugees, mainly from Syria. The UK has about 150,000 refugees. So Germany accepts more people in a day than the UK accepts in 5 years. This is a question which is not, to me, related to migration, but is a completely separate question, which is, what is our position as a country? What do we think our global responsibility is? What share of the global burden are we prepared to carry? And of course, Oxford has been remarkable in this respect, and the charity here, Welcome Charity, is a remarkable organization which tries to help with this. So different cities have different views within our country. But I'm not going to talk about refugees, because I think this is a separate question to the question which governs the choice of how do we view migrants that have a choice? And that's how I define them. The refugee flows are very unstable because they tend to be propelled by events like the Syrian conflict, Afghan conflict, by natural disasters, etc. And they're very unpredictable, although the trend is going up. And of course, if conflict goes up, that's likely to go up. But the overwhelming majority, as I say, in neighboring countries. Migration is a much more stable phenomena. I mentioned the 3%, and it's much more predictable, and it's much more discretionary. In other words, people have a discretionary choice as whether they're going to migrate, or who in their family is going to migrate. And we, as recipients, have a discretionary choice as to whether we want to accept them, who we want to accept, for how long, etc. And that's a choice which I believe should be made on different basis to the choice for refugees. The alternative for these individuals is not the same. The alternative for refugees is about life and death. The alternative for migrants is more about the improvement in their well-being and that of those around them. So they're different, and I think, therefore, it's appropriate to think of migration in terms of the economic costs and benefits, whereas I think that is a lesser concern. The numbers are much smaller as well when it comes to refugees. Now, a lot of what shapes the impact of migrants is governed by who the migrants are. And one of the stark facts which emerges from doing a very simple analysis of this is that they're not normal people. Well, my book called them exceptional people because they are exceptional in their communities, and they're also exceptional in the communities they go to in all sorts of respects, and exceptional in the good sense of the word. But they're also exceptional because they're not representative of the rest of the populations they leave or the rest of the populations they go to. And one of the differences is their age profile, which is fundamentally different to the age profile of where they're leaving and where they're going to. With refugees, it's much more similar. In other words, children also have to leave in refugee situations. Elderly people also have to leave. But when it comes to discretionary migrants, you see this phenomena that they typically are of working age. And this is a very significant difference. So about 57% of the world population is of working age, and about 78% of migrants are of working age. A very different constitution, and that affects many dimensions of their impact in it. And this is simply reflecting that story. This is becoming more the case, and what you see is the migrant share of high-income countries becoming more concentrated in the working age groups. So this trend, which has always been there, it was there in the age of mass migration in the 1800s as well, is becoming more acute. People don't want to leave home, basically, and that's why only 3% of the world's population of migrants. And even in situations where there are no borders at all, let's take Europe, let's take the Schengen area of 26 countries in Europe where people can migrate freely, the numbers are not very different. Why? When you have 50% unemployment in the south of Europe, in certain cities in the south of Spain or in Greece, don't more people leave? And the reason is people leave for work. People don't leave because they're scroungers and they want to benefit from someone else's benefit system. They leave because they have to, and it's largely income determined. They want to improve their own livelihoods and those of their families, communities that they tend to support. So this story is a story which is pretty universal, that the migrants are concentrating and increasingly concentrated in the working age groups. Now, in trying to analyze the economic impact of migrants, what you'll see in this GPS report that I've referred to is a very large number of economic modeling exercises. And if you don't like economics, just skip that section. But what we tried to do was make a series of assumptions and model the economic impact, the growth impact with and without migration of a whole lot of different countries over a period of time. And this is the sorts of things that you'll see reflected there. And what this is simply doing is saying, what would the UK look like if we had frozen migration in 1990 and not had any new migrants? And the different curves, the difference between that one, which is what you have, the actual economic activity, this is the one, the dashed one, if you'd simply taken them out, and the third line, the lower line, is if you'd also not reallocated the capital. So every worker has a certain amount of money or capital associated with their employment, the equipment they use, and other things. And one of the questions, if you're not going to have migrants, is what happens to that? Do you have more for the remaining people, or is that money only there because the migrants are there to use it effectively? And those are the different assumptions we made there, called with or without the capital quantity effects. But what you see in this, although it's not immediately apparent, it's more apparent when you do the indexed analysis of this, is that migrants have been extremely significant. So just over this period that we looked at, the UK economy benefited by something like £175 billion from migrants, and would be £175 billion at least poorer had it not been for migrants. And this is a static analysis, and I'll come back to what that means in a minute. So the UK economy is about £2 trillion. That means it's of an order of magnitude of about 8 to 9%, at least, of the UK economy. We've done this for a whole series of countries. I have some Australian friends, so we show this. It's about 10% of the Australian economy that would be taken out if you had frozen migration, and you can do it with other countries. For the US, we did this, and we did another sort of exercise, which is after the crash, looking at the contribution of migrants to the recovery in the US. And what we show here is that about 2/3 of the recovery in the US is due to the impact of migrations. And if you had frozen migration at that point, the growth would be appropriately lower. So these are extremely significant growth effects on economies that come from migrants. And this is just summarizing some of these, but you'll see many, many more in this report. Now, all economic analysis, of course, depends on the assumptions you make, and we've done a whole lot of different analysis, but what we haven't done, and why we think these are very significant underestimates, is look at the dynamic impact of migrants. And this is the most neglected part of the story in the literature. We tend to, when you look at analyses of migration, say, okay, what's the situation with and without migrants in terms of what I, for example, have just done? Or you look at the impact on tax and spend, and I'll show you some numbers on that in a minute, and say, are migrants contributing more to tax, to the fiscal revenues in taxes than now taking out in, say, social welfare? That's typically the sort of question that is asked. It's very seldom that people ask, what is the dynamic impact? What would be the long-term impact on a society if you removed or reduced migration? And when you look at this, then it becomes particularly dramatic. Indeed, I would argue, for example, with Brexit and the big attempt to slow down immigration into Britain, this and some other side effects which are unintended will be amongst the most dramatic consequences for the UK, including, incidentally, much lower female labor force participation, because migrants are associated with much higher, particularly skilled women, ability to integrate into the labor force. So one of the things I would predict is with Brexit, let's say it happens, and let's say there's a sharp reduction in unskilled migrants, we will expect many less British skilled women to work, because migrants do childcare, migrants do many other activities which release women, particularly, also men, but more women on average, to work. So these dynamic effects are very significant, and they come from a series of different interactions, which are to do with the basics of what drives innovation in societies and dynamism in societies. And this is about diversity. It's about different perspectives and challenges. It's about people learning things in different ways. It's about people having a higher entrepreneurial drive because they have more ability to take risk or more need to take risk than others in society. It's about not having grown up in the old school, not necessarily have learned from their parents and repeating their parents' mistakes going forward, but learning in new ways and bringing new ideas. And you see the virtuous circle associated with this. And you particularly see the virtuous circle, of course, in dynamic cities. And it's in dynamic cities that this becomes evident in a number of ways. It's no accident that dynamic cities create this virtuous circle. London, which has a very significant share of migrants. Over 30% of Londoners are migrants. Melbourne, Australia in general, but Melbourne, 40% migrants. Toronto, 50% migrants. Vancouver, over 40% migrants. These are not accidents, that these cities are also voted as the happiest cities to live in, the best cities, that people want to be there, and of course, that they create creative and technological hubs. This process is a virtuous circle. So migrants establish themselves, they create a dynamism, they attract more networks, more people want to go there. They also have global networks, so they're able to establish investment flows, trade flows, export flows, etc. More people come to service their needs, and you get this virtuous circle. When you look at the data, it's these dynamic effects that begin to give you a sense of what's really happening in Silicon Valley, for example. Silicon Valley, when you think of the iconic firms there, it's actually very difficult to think of an iconic firm that's not started by a migrant. There are a few, but they're the small minority. So the Googles, Intels, Yahoo, Tesla, etc., all migrant or migrant parent founded. And this is a phenomenon which tends to be more widely applicable. So migrants are 2 to 3 times more likely than the rest of the population to be associated with a startup in the US and in the UK as well. They're more 2 to 4 times as likely to be associated with a unicorn. A unicorn is a firm of a startup that reaches $1 billion in value. 2 to 4 times more likely. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be associated with innovation defined in a variety of different ways, but including patents, including startups, etc. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be Nobel Prize winners than the rest of the population. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be Academy Award winners, Booker Prize winners, etc. If you read an excellent book by Rob Winder, called Bloody Foreigners, the subtitle is The Story of Immigration into Britain, he just traces from the 1200s the innovations in Britain, whether it's in banking, whether it's in architecture, or the arts, or in industry, or manufacturing, or in the Industrial Revolution, or elsewhere, and he links it to the immigrants. The patent data is very clear on this, but way overweight a representation of migrants. It's also reflected in the science application. Something like 40% of the new science appointments in the US are migrants, even though they are 12% of the population. It's particularly acute in AI and tech and in new areas. And of course, I've talked about thriving cities, which have 2 to 4 times the number of migrants of rest of countries. This virtuous circle that's created. So when you threaten these skilled flows, you're not only threatening the static gains that I talked about and gave some numbers to, you're threatening the long-term growth of your society and dynamism of your society. Of course, you're also threatening your national finances, your debt levels, and your fiscus, your balance of taxation and payments. Now, there are various ways in which migrants contribute to this, and one shouldn't generalize for all places at all times, because the specifics are very important, and policy makes a huge difference. Are migrants allowed to work? Are they allowed, particularly, to work in skills which they are trained for? And one of the great challenges, not least in the UK, is that migrants tend to be overqualified for the jobs they're in. And one of the reasons why they're a threat to low-skilled workers is because more skilled workers, migrant workers, are taking lower skilled jobs. They're overqualified for them. So these things of integration really matter, these dimensions. There's certain aspects of society where you have a fixed expenditure. Let's think of something like defense. You're most probably likely to spend roughly the same amount on defense whether you have 60 million people or 65 million people in your country. And those things therefore become, the more migrants that are paying tax, the more that sort of expenditure is distributed amongst a larger number of people, even if they're going to be benefiting. Because of the structure of pensions, etc., migrants don't tend to take away with them their social benefits. Indeed, one of the things that I've been advocating for a long time is pension reform to allow portability of pensions. And so what you have in social welfare systems, because of this working age point I made at the beginning, a much higher contribution level than withdrawal level on social security. The policies matter enormously. This is expenditures on the left-hand panel on education and health. And what you see is this very large share of expenditure on education in young ages. Some of you might be benefiting from that, but soon to stop benefiting by about the age of 24, 25. And then, of course, the health expenditure starts kicking in, particularly in old age. These are public expenditures. This is migrants' profiles. And what you see is that they're not in the age groups that draw heavily on this. And one of the reasons that migrants contribute so positively to government finances is that they don't basically make a claim on the two biggest items of expenditure, which are health and education, in nearly the same proportion that the rest of the population do. Now, of course, whether migrants pay taxes or not is a policy decision and is to do with this thing about whether they're documented or not, whether they're treated fairly or not, whether they're recognized, whether they're incorporated, etc. If migrants are in an underground economy, not paying taxes, well, then they don't contribute in the same way to direct income taxes, but they do contribute still to value added and other taxes in that way. But clearly, the more that they're integrated, the better. This is across the OECD, and this data is from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, across a very wide range of countries. And basically, above the line is positive, below the line is negative, and you see that it's really only in Germany and Poland because of, in Germany, the very strong structure of support given to migrants, and in Poland, for different reasons, but much smaller numbers, that you see a negative fiscal impact. Now, interestingly enough, although this detail is not really that relevant, whether migrants have many households have mixed. In other words, one member of the family is migrant, the other is not, and they tend to do the best in terms of their fiscal contributions. But in all of them, except for these two down here, you see this very positive story on migration. In terms of the cost of provision, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but what the story is here is that migrants tend to be more educated in certain sectors than the rest of the population for the jobs that they are in. And therefore they are also, because they are overqualified, contributing more than the capital invested in their education. So you bring someone from another country, you put them in the job. Britain has not paid for the education of a nurse or a doctor or anyone else that it employs. It's the other country that pays for that. And what you're getting is the benefit without the cost. And the more educated they are, the more you're getting the taxpayers in another country to pay for the people that you're benefiting. Now, this raises a question which I'll come to in the end about the fairness from development perspective. You also see that the age people left education, which is a surrogate for levels of education, is higher for migrants. I mentioned female labor force participation. This is an analysis, a regression analysis, which looked at female labor force participation and the extent to which there was the availability of migrant care workers, showing this very strong correlation. An area which has been the subject of much contesting is this question of wages. Do migrants suppress wages or not of local people? There's huge disagreement amongst economists about this. I'm absolutely convinced that they don't. But it's whatever the conclusion, these are insignificant numbers. When you're going to say 1 or 2% of wages, the numbers are very, very small, positive or negative. And this is static. This is in the short term that you do it. And of course, what I'm saying is that the economies are much bigger. What's important is to say which workers, and this is an attempt to do that, to look at the income percentile. This is the richest workers, that's the poorest workers, and see what the impact of migrants will be on the wage distribution. And what you see from this is that where migrants suppress wages of natives is in the lowest income threshold. The bottom 10%, basically, of British workers might have their wages pushed down by migrants, but everyone else is having their wages increased by migrants. And that's because the economy is growing faster and there are more jobs. And of course, that's even truer in the dynamic cities. Now, what's happening at the bottom there, we believe, is overqualified migrants are competing with underqualified natives. And that's a story about the need for recognition of migrant skills so that these overqualified migrants can do the jobs they're actually qualified to do. I want to, in conclusion, talk a bit about the politics and disconnect from what I hope I've convinced you is an overwhelmingly positive economic story. And this is where things get very, very difficult to understand. People don't believe what the reality is. So this is perceived versus actual share of migrants. And you're typically seeing people think that there are about 3 times as many migrants in the societies as they are. In the UK, they're about 12%. People think they're about 35%. Just very, very big differences in perception. What's strange is that this perception is not really driving. And this is the thing I found most surprising looking at all these surveys of perception, that perceptions on migration haven't actually changed. When you ask people, do you want more or less migrants? Are migrants good for the economy or bad? Would you like to kick out migrants? Most people's views have not changed over time. And so trying to understand how the politics has changed is very difficult. In some countries, like in Germany, despite the massive influx of refugees in 2015, 2016, people are no more negative in their views about migration now than they were before. In fact, they seem to be more permissive. In other words, they're willing to accept more migrants even than they were then. So this disconnect is very strange. This is the UK's disconnect. This is, the higher you go up on this, the more you feel you should be restricting migrants. And these are simply survey results over time. And what you see is actually people are feeling better about migration when you ask them in this. And the details, as I said, are all in this GPS. This is the UK being the outlier in terms of people feeling they want more restriction, and quite a recent phenomenon on that. I feel, and this is together with my co-author Ben Nabarro in this GPS, that a lot of what we're seeing here is not a change in the reality. In other words, there are no more migrants. And indeed, people's perceptions are not more negative. But what we're seeing is a change in the politics and the formation of political alliances based on values, identity, and other areas rather than on questions like what is good for the British economy. So it's a change in the way that politics is being formed, and that's related to lots of changes, including in social media and the change in the way that people get their information and are communicated with in terms of political mobilization. So the curators of the narrative have lost the story. And it's that losing it in terms of we don't know how to tell the story to enough people, which becomes quite central to this question. When people feel, if they're in political leadership, that the only way to build a new alliance of to gain politically is to tell a narrative which is anti-migrant, even though it bears no relationship to the reality. This has also been associated with a particularly sharp rise in this authoritarian right-wing parties, which is related to a whole lot of other factors, not least to the financial crisis, as I've analyzed separately with the BBC. This rise since 2008 crisis in people's disdain for authority, for experts, not least for economists, that brought them the financial crisis, is associated with a generalized disdain of the parties and the old authorities, and a new alliance building, which is very, very significant. Now, people's views are very driven by this national narrative. One of the things which is so striking is when you ask people, do you think that migrants are a problem to you or your community? This is the UK. Very few people, or a minority certainly, believe it is. But when you say, do you think they're a problem nationally, about 4 to 5 times as many people say, yes, it's a problem nationally. So it's not a problem for me, it's not a problem for my town, but it's a problem for the country. And this disconnect between local and national is very, very stark. And we believe that's driven by the media, social media, and the politicians' narrative telling people that this is a national problem, even if it's not their own experience in their own workplace or in their own community, that it's a national problem. Now, there are other factors which come on top of this, and what the financial crisis did, and not least austerity, is it made scarcity and congestion a much bigger issue for people. Congested trains, scarcity of housing stock, longer queues in the NHS, whatever it is, these things have been accentuated by government policy. And scarcity, of course, feeds a resentment around numbers and foreigners and local, even though, of course, what we know is that without migrants, the scarcity would be much worse because they keep down wages, they contribute to the NHS and other areas. So in conclusion, the first point I made was that I think we should think about refugees differently. They're a different category, and one of the problems is the muddled thinking that's conflating refugees and migrants. I believe we should accept many more refugees, not least in the UK, and I believe that's a humanitarian and ethical issue. But on migration, I'm very comfortable that we have an economic debate, and that's one that I'm hoping I've engaged in. That this is a stock of migrants has remained about 3% of the world's population. The idea that we somehow being in a new era is a myth, but it's one that are driven by the absolute numbers. I hope I've demonstrated that migration improves overall prosperity and particularly dynamism, and that less migration would not only mean slower growth in our economies, but it would mean a much smaller economy, and of course, a much less diverse economy. In other words, the key sources of our dynamism would be kept out. Attributing adverse outcomes to migration misses the context, not least the post-financial crisis, and other contributing factors. There's been widening inequality, particularly for the bottom of the income differential. There's been growing scarcity of housing stock. There's been growing challenges to public transport, to public health and other resources. And of course, there's been a heightened perception of risk. Terrorism, pandemics, climate change, all heightened perceptions around risk. But to conflate these with migration is a massive mistake. The negative impact, which is particularly felt by low-skilled people of migrants, and we must acknowledge that and accept that not migrants don't benefit everyone. They have a very diverse impact, particularly benefiting skilled and middle-income people. The negative impact on low-skilled could be reduced by much better integration, particularly of high-skilled migrants into our society. I haven't dwelt at all on the demographic headwinds that countries face, but this is going to be an absolutely key issue. And one of the difficulties which I discuss in Exceptional People and in the report is that countries which have some of the biggest fertility challenges seem to be most adverse to migration. Poland and Hungary have the lowest fertility rates in the world, 1.3. They have a massive future challenge of too few workers, and yet we know they are amongst the most against migrants. So how one reconciles what countries need with what they're doing, and Japan is just beginning to go through this big transformation and beginning to rethink its migration policies after being extremely restrictive. Other countries like Spain and Greece, but particularly Spain, have had massive demographic challenges and also economic crises, and yet have been much more open to migration. So you cannot draw a strict correlation between the demography and the politics, or between the economics and the politics. How political leadership engages, what they make sense of, and what their narrative is, becomes the driving force of the way that people understand this, and how one connects migration reality from the real concerns of people regarding all these other things. Now, another argument against migration, which some people have made, is that actually we shouldn't accept migrants because we're doing a bad thing for developing countries, the brain drain. I believe this is a total red herring, because there are real concerns. We need to care about the fact that half the professionals in Africa are not in Africa. We need to care about the fact that 60% of Caribbean professionals are not in the Caribbean. But we need to understand this in a much wider context. We need to understand this in the context of the fact what's happening here is a transfer from the south or from developing countries to the north. If you include the numbers invested in the education of these people, it's a much bigger transfer to rich countries from poor countries than, for example, aid is. Now, these migrants, of course, are sending back over $400 billion a year to the countries they come from. They sustain communities. It tends to be counter-cyclical. In other words, they send back more money when people need it more, in other words, when times are bad. So this is stabilizing. But also in the end, these are about choices. And there are many examples of how it's done effectively. The Philippines, for example, trains many more nurses than it requires domestically. And this allows Filipino people to leave their country, to get jobs, and to send money home. They would be unemployed if they stayed at home. And the similar thing happens elsewhere. So we need to have a concern about this. But diaspora and diaspora politics, how one engages the diaspora, and Robin has done great work amongst others on this, whether one uses this as an excuse not to accept people, or whether one uses it as a reason to treat them fairly, and indeed to treat their countries fairly? Should the NHS in the UK send back to countries that have trained nurses and doctors the equivalent of the cost of that training, which would have been paid if they'd been trained in the UK? Is that the appropriate response? Or is it the individuals that come that should pay back to their countries what they have taken out of it, because they're the ones that might be gaining? Those are the sorts of debates we should have, not debates about restricting people's right to move or their right to find a better life elsewhere. And certainly as someone who escaped apartheid and then went back to South Africa and contributed, I also believe in the concept of brain circulation. In other words, you leave and you go back. This is not a one-way street, and there's much more. So I believe what we need is a much better deal for migrants, that we should accept more migrants, but with that should come a very clear understanding of our responsibilities and also the rights of the migrants and their responsibilities. To pay tax, to abide by the law, to be in all respects as law-abiding and as tax-paying as all other citizens, but with that also enjoy the rights that come with being in a country in terms of being respected, minimum wages, health and safety, access to resources, etc. This, of course, can be done now because one can also have more control. With new technologies, one knows who's in one's society. And so I do believe, although this is a fraught debate, in the need for documentation, knowing who's in our societies. Just to conclude, I hope what I've also illustrated in this is the importance of thinking about economic questions in a broader context. And in the context of the seminar series, where we think about new economics, of not only at the micro level, what the impact is on households, on families, on wages, etc., but also the economy-wide, and how you move from the micro to the macro, the importance of institutions, of behavior, of politics, of course, and that economics can, if one wants it to be relevant. This is the report I mentioned, Migration and the Economy, free download. I think there are also a few copies around the Oxford Martin School, and I want to credit my co-author, Ben Navarro, particularly for the huge amount of work that he did on with me. This is Exceptional People, and that's the core website if you are intrigued by economics and want to learn more. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was fascinating and a huge amount there. So we have some time for some questions. Who would like to go first in the blue?
Hi, I actually study the politics side, so it's interesting to hear economists always give your own perspective. So I just have two questions and one fact. My first question, would it be a fair... I'm here. Hello. Can you see me? Okay. Good. Would it be a fair assessment to say that if you were to come up with your favorite immigration policy, it would be some amount of skill-based selection, you prefer high skill and low skill, and encourage circular migration? My second question, I was quickly looking at the appendix of this report, and you hold the relationship between labor and capital fixed, so you're also a specialist of technological change, so isn't that assumption, can you discuss that assumption more? The third one is just a fact. I study the people who are most likely in this room embrace immigration in practice. When you actually tell them that immigrants are going to move to their neighborhoods and affect their schools, there's a huge not in my backyard phenomenon. So I wonder how you also integrate that in your own thinking.
Yeah. Thank you. On the first, models, yes. Circulation, high-skilled. I think we also need to accept that low-skilled are a vital part. I think what the UK's recent policy is crazy on low-skilled migrants, 12-month limitation, that sort of thing. What we also learn is that some of the most innovative people can be from low-skilled families, Steve Jobs, for example, but many others. And so one needs to be, I think, very careful, but I absolutely do think that many more high-skilled is key, particularly for the dynamism story. The second question is on the fixed effects. Yes, that's a major assumption to assume that technological change, it's a very typical assumption of this sort of economic modeling, particularly because what we're saying is that actually there's a dynamic effect embedded in it. There aren't many good techniques, particularly if you get into the CGE type of modeling that we're doing for having technological change. But Economics is a very primitive science, and this is sort of the toolbox that we played with at this level. Your final point, which is, yes, what matters in the end is what happens in local communities, is absolutely the point. I'd highlight the disconnect between the perception surveys that actually tell you that people are much more happy in their local community than they think the situation is nationally. So it's not the case that people have a problem locally which is then amplified into their national concerns. The opposite seems to be the case. They hear national amplification and they think that must be a problem when they're actually saying, only 20% of people are saying, that's a problem for me. But it is a real issue, and one of the things we need to accept with migration, and it's I started my life as a trade economist, so in trade we know a lot about disruption to industries locally being in the national good. You close down a certain type of industry, you're doing it because it's consumers, everyone's going to be better off, but people are hurt and communities are hurt. And in those situations, you have all sorts of trade adjustment measures. You help people move, you help people reskill, you put more resources in. That's what you've got to do with migration. In other words, if we believe that migration is good for the economy, we should be helping Slough, we should be helping places that are suffering from overload of schools or housing or health or transport systems. And the other way people experience this overload by giving them additional resources because it's in the national interest to do so. In other words, it's short-term local costs, long-term national benefits associated with migration. Now, this raises a whole lot of other questions whether we should be distributing people around our country, which, for example, Canada does. You can come, but you go and work there. That's a whole other debate, and I think in a small country like the UK, you're pushing against the tide to try and do that.
Thanks, Ian. You've got a glass of water.
Thank you very much.
Another question. Right at the back there has got a...
Hi, Ian. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Just have, first of all, a point of clarification on when you talk about migration being 3%, you're just talking about international migration. Yes. Presumably internal migration is significantly higher.
Yes, I should have made that distinction. Everything I was talking about was cross-border migration. And just as a little parenthesis on that, which I didn't say, of course, there's 100 more countries than there were 100 years ago. And if you're defining migration as people moving across a border, that means you should actually expect a lot more migrants. You used to go and visit your family somewhere, now suddenly it's another country, not least in the Soviet Union, where there are 15 new countries, or in Africa. So it's surprising there's actually not more migrants. Yeah,
thank you. And the other question is just when it comes to kind of intensive growth, GDP will grow with more migrants, we know that, but I'd like a bit more clarification on GDP growth per capita, because you did give some examples, some outliers such as Silicon Valley, and you also talked about the implications of women in the workforce. But I think there are also costs too in terms of diversity. Diversity, as we know, is great, but it takes a lot of time and investment for it to work. And I'd be really keen to hear if you could demonstrate with any certainty that migration, compared to, say, a natural increase in the birth rate, increases GDP at a higher rate. Because then that would be an argument, particularly in a dense population area such as the UK, for more migration because we can grow the economy without needing as many people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The first thing to say about all migration research is that this is an infant game. It's just surprising to me how little work is done on migration. That's good quality. And what's done tends to be in the UK and the US. So there's whole countries where there's no data analyzed. And when you get into these dynamic effects or growth effects, it's even more complex to do it. So big sort of plea for more research, and I hope some of you will do that. On the demographics, you can rely on natural growth. I mean, bear in mind this demographic headwind, that most advanced economies are actually contracting demographically, so fertility is very low, workforces are low, are reducing as a share of the population, dependency ratios are increasing, so you're going to have a smaller share of your population supporting a greater share And productivity is also slowing down across the OECD, and that's a whole other area that we're working on. Why? But this is a key part of that, what's happening with the demographics. And in some countries, not least like the east of Europe, Poland, Hungary, it's dramatic, and Japan. This is really dramatic. China's another example where it's dramatic, but China's got a population of 1.3 billion, so it has, and there's a lot of people in the countryside. It's got some absorption space, which would mean they don't require migrants in the short term. But other countries do. So one is that if you rely on demographics, you're actually going to have a contracting economy. A smaller share of your economy in growth, a smaller share of your workforce will be working, smaller share of your population will be working, and they are less productive. And there's a whole set of reasons why. And so your economy per capita income numbers are declining. So that's the first big warning. The second is the, what I agree remains anecdotal or segmental. Look at the Nobel Prize winners, look at the patents, look at the startups, and draw national inferences. But it is the case that these sectors are the most dynamic sectors in the economy. So take out the technology sector, for example, from the US economy, and you have zero growth. So these are the dynamic, high-growth sectors of the economy, science, technology, arts, culture, which are pulling the rest of the economy along. And that sort of, I think, creates a compelling case. So you're right that the economic analysis is not what it should be. I think there's enough other evidence that points towards the significance. And certainly the cities data is also very compelling on this. Try and understand why cities are dynamic, and then look at the migration story there, and it becomes very compelling as well.
Okay, I'm going to fit in one last question. I think there was one there, person with the hand up, with the green t-shirt.
So the categories of migrant and refugees are like fallible categories, and they exist on a sliding scale. So especially because you argue that higher educated migrants are more desirable, how does your argument that that it's an economic argument and morality and justice are less important fit for less educated, lower income migrants?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's going to become more significant as AI and machine learning and other technologies make more and more people with low skills and even some high-skilled people unemployed, not least in developing countries. So this is a big question, and I agree that it's a moral maze. So I don't want to say that someone who can't get a job and whose family starves somehow doesn't have a moral claim and is fundamentally different to a refugee. But the framework is different of thinking about it, I think. So I think we'll be going there, and part of the interest is how do you think about this and make judgment on it. My view, I mean, there's a number of things to say. One is that it could be that we need more unskilled people in the future. It's difficult to think of AI disintermediation of cleaning our streets, washing our salad in a restaurant, but it's easy to think of AI disintermediation in a whole lot of skilled jobs like lawyers, accountants, and other things that I look forward to the end of. Sorry, with all due respect to all the legal fraternity and accounting fraternity in the room. Great professions.
What about economists?
Yeah, and economists. So it's not clear what the skill implication distribution is going to be. And as we go forward and we have rapidly aging societies, we're certainly going to need a lot more carers. Now, some people will call carers very skilled people, and they are. So it's partly how you define skill and whether people can develop skills and accumulate skills which will be appropriate for the demand side of what the advanced economies are needing, if that's where people are going to move to. The other thing I failed to say, which is also highlighted by this, and obviously I'm encouraged to look at the report to see all the things I failed to say, is that most migrants are actually between developing countries. So don't make the assumption that this is simply a poor country to rich country story. It's not.
Thank you. Just before asking you to thank Ian again, let me tell you about the next couple of lectures coming up in this series. Next week, the 24th of January, we have Ben Ansell, Professor Ben Ansell, who's from the politics department here, who's going to be talking about wealth inequality, but from a political perspective. Be a really fascinating talk. The following week, we have two real star talks. The first, which is on the Tuesday, the 29th, is Nick Stern, Lord Stern. And you'll all know Stern from his climate change report, The Economics of Climate Change. But Nick will be talking about his new book, which is entitled How Lives Change. And this is part of an extraordinarily long-term study of development economics in India. And then this time in a fortnight, we have a talk by an equally astonishing person, Mariana Mazzucato. And Mariana has written a series of books. Her latest one is called The Value of Everything, The Economics of Value. And she'll be talking actually not here, but in the Blavatnik School. So it's first of a joint event that the Martin School has been doing with the Blavatnik School. And there are further talks later on in the term. And as you leave, you'll see a flyer for this talk series. So I hope you'll be able to come along to as many of them as you are able. So let me finish by thanking Ian again for a really fascinating and thought-provoking talk.